said it's good, but I'm not dead. But it's in my head, it's in my head. You said it's good, but I'm not dead. But
Good morning and welcome to Beyond the Headlines on CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Maria Svetkova. Beyond the Headlines is a weekly current affairs radio show that aims to make public policy discussions more accessible to you. We take you beyond the headlines of our daily news, bringing you access to current leaders through in-depth interviews. You can join us in conversation by tweeting at beyond_headlines. That's BYOND_headlines. On today's episode, we'll be talking about ODSP and medical assistance in dying, or otherwise known as MAiD. There's currently inadequate funding and support for people living with disabilities in Ontario through the Ontario Disability Support Program. An overwhelming majority of ODSP recipients live in poverty, with access to affordable housing and affordable healthcare being out of reach for many. This problem is coupled with the expansion in 2021 of the eligibility for Canada's medical assistance in dying, which has seen increased rates of applications from those struggling under Ontario's system. There has been much concern over the potential future expansion in March of this year, and our first guest, Mike Schreiner, a member of Provincial Parliament and leader of the Ontario Green Party since 2009, will be speaking to us about the recent trend and what can be done about improving ODSP. Our second guest, Trevor Manon, outlines the work done by the ODSP Action Coalition, of which he is Secretary Co-Chair, and the challenges faced by those who rely on the group and their advocacy. Our first guest is MPP Mike Schreiner, leader of the Ontario Green Party since 2009 and the first Green MPP elected to the Ontario Legislature in 2018, an office he still proudly holds today. Growing up on a farm, Mike was instilled with a passion for protecting people, animals, and the planet at a young age. At Queen's Park, Mike works across party lines to zealously advocate for climate action, income equality, transparent leadership, healthcare initiatives, affordable housing, and much, much more. In his time there, he introduced bills to cap Ontario's carbon emissions while making reporting on yearly emissions numbers mandatory. He pushed to eliminate sick notes, conserve drinking water, and get big money out of politics. Mike passed Ontario's first ever green law in 2019, which protects electric vehicle drivers by making it illegal to block electric vehicle charging stations. Today, Mike will be joining us to talk about an issue that has been making several headlines and one in which he knows very well. And that is the issue of ODSP poverty and the ODSP recipients seeking out MAiD. Beyond the Headlines listeners, our first guest is MPP Mike Schreiner, leader of the Ontario Green Party since 2009 and the first Green MPP elected to the Ontario Legislature in 2018, an office he still proudly holds today. At Queen's Park, Mike works across party lines to zealously advocate for climate action, income equality, transparent leadership, healthcare initiatives, affordable housing, and much, much more. And today, Mike will be joining me to talk about an issue that has made several headlines and one in which he knows very well, and that is the issue of ODSP recipients seeking out MAiD.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you, and thanks once again for joining us on the show today. Just to get the ball rolling, I want to just start off with asking you to talk to us a little bit about how ODSP actually works. What's the payment like? How much is it per month? What's the eligibility looking like? And is it different for different people?
Yeah, so first of all, ODSP rates in Ontario are cruelly low, forcing people to live in legislated poverty. So even after the Ford government brought in a 5% increase for a single recipient for ODSP recipients, a single recipient still only receives slightly more than $1,200 a month. And that's broken down into a shelter allowance and a living allowance, broken down about $700 for living, $500 for shelter. But if you think about it in Toronto, the average one-bedroom apartment is well over $2,000, around $2,400, depending on which estimate you look at. Mm-hmm. Even in a community like mine in Guelph, it's one-bedroom apartments averaging around $1,900 a month. So imagine trying to live on $1,200 a month and still be able to put food on the table, pay for your basic expenses, etc.
Mhm.
And on top of that, people with disabilities oftentimes have additional expenses that people without disabilities just don't face. And there are programs that ODSP recipients can apply for to help with some of those additional expenses. But each level of red tape that a person has to go through to receive benefits creates barriers to accessing those benefits.
Mhm.
And so I've been a strong advocate for ending legislated poverty in Ontario by doubling ODSP rates because the human and social costs of forcing people to live in legislated poverty are simply too high.
So is it different for those who are still able to work versus those who are unable to work?
Yeah, so the one thing that the government has recently done in the fall economic statement, which is something I was strongly advocating for, was increasing what's known as the work allowance. So an ODSP recipient prior to these changes was allowed to earn up to $200 per month before their benefits would start being clawed back. And so that has increased to $1,000, which makes a lot of sense to me, because for those folks who are living with a disability and able to integrate employment into their lives, not penalizing them for that, I think, is a good thing, and enabling people to be able to supplement their income up to $1,000 a month before you start seeing ODSP benefits clawed back makes a ton of sense. That being said, there's thousands and thousands of people across the province whose disabilities are so severe that they're unable to work.
Mhm.
And so it infuriates me when, the Premier Ford get up and say, well, we want to get people off of ODSP and into the workplace, and the solution is a job. And
Mhm.
pretty much everyone I know with a disability wants a job, but not everyone is able to work, and not all workplaces accommodate people with disabilities.
Right.
And so that's why I think we as a society have a moral obligation to ensure that people with disabilities do not live in legislated poverty. And that's
Mhm.
exactly why we need to double ODSP rates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also not to mention those on disability who are caregivers and who have children or
Absolutely.
elders. In my previous role, I've heard countless stories of ODSP recipients living in poverty, unable to afford these basic life necessities. And this wasn't just in Ontario too. I mean, this was I've heard from people in Alberta as well. And in the past year, we've seen an increase in the number of applications for medical assistance in dying, not because of their physical conditions, but because these recipients just can't afford to live. They, like you said, they can't afford to live in their homes and buy groceries and access these social services. For example, I have some anecdotes here as well. Someone like Amir Farsood, a 54-year-old man in St. Catharines, says, "I don't want to die, but I don't want to be homeless more than I don't want to die." And for Farsood, the waitlist for affordable housing is 7 years. And another story, Richard Ewald says he's not suicidal and wouldn't be doing it if he wasn't so stuck in this situation with ODSP. And in my opinion, I think this is an egregious issue that is 100% preventable. I know you already talked about doubling the ODSP rates, but what more is there to be done to combat this issue? Because it's quite an intersecting one as well.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's a lot of intersecting issues. And I think the two most important to address, well, I'll say three actually, but the two I would put at the top are ending legislated poverty by increasing social assistance rates. And the second is ensuring that everyone in Ontario has an affordable place to call home.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a housing affordability crisis, and
Yeah.
we have a whole generation of young people wondering if they'll ever be able to own a home. What's going to solve the housing affordability crisis is to build homes that people can actually afford in the communities they want to live in, close to their family, their work, and their social support systems, which is critically important. Secondly, governments have to get involved in helping fund, especially deeply affordable housing. And that's why I was so proud the Green Party was not only the first party to propose doubling social assistance rates, but also the first party to make a firm financial commitment backed up with a plan of how to pay for it to build 160,000 affordable housing spaces in Ontario, 100,000 that would be like co-op, nonprofit social housing, and 60,000 permanent supportive housing spaces with wraparound mental health, addictions, and other supports. Because we know that stabilizing people's lives, housing and poverty are intricately linked and must be solved if we're going to provide just the basic necessities people need to ensure a quality of life and a stable quality of life. And then when I say the third on top of that is it gets to the wraparound supports. Like, we need to ensure that people have the social supports they need, whether it's to address mental health concerns, physical health concerns, access to community and social supports. Because even if you provide housing and remove people from poverty, I mean, if they're living in isolation, that becomes problematic for people as well.
Right.
So ensuring that we end poverty, everyone has an affordable place to live, and that we have basic community and social supports that support people to thrive. What's so infuriating for me is, the government, the four governments rolling out the red carpet to turn millions into billions.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, they can't find the funding to increase social assistance rates.
Yeah.
They're unwilling to make the investments and the legislative changes that would enable municipalities to build truly affordable homes in affordable communities where people want to live.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I just want to say to this government, like, your priorities are so, they're just so misplaced.
Yeah.
Let's put average people with disabilities ahead of a handful of wealthy land speculators.
Mm-hmm. I guess on that note, I'd like to address a common argument that I hear whenever, someone talks about increased spending for social services. So many people associate the increase in social spending with an increase in their personal taxes. So why would or wouldn't that be the case for the average Ontarian?
Well, I mean, first of all, there was a pre-pandemic study that showed that poverty costs this province $33 billion a year. My guess is that number's higher now. It's a few years old. And so when we fail to address poverty and homelessness in particular, the cost to our healthcare system, our criminal justice system, our policing and first responders, just the stopgaps that are inefficient use of money to, fill in the cracks. Perfect example of that, I was in a meeting this morning where social service agencies were saying, if we just have permanent supportive housing for people, the money we're currently spending just like on hotel rooms, for example, just to try to give somebody, a place to sleep tonight because it's minus 20 degrees, it would be so much better spent actually solving the crisis by investing in permanent supportive housing. So by ending poverty and ensuring everyone has an affordable place to call home, it'll actually save us money.
Yeah.
There's good studies showing that every $10 invested in permanent supportive housing saves $21.75 in other social services. So I would say to people, you're paying for that, and you're paying more in tax dollars, responding to the social and human costs of poverty than you would spend if we actually made the investments to end legislative poverty in the first place. In the short term, yes, it would cost a bit more money to make those investments, but in the medium to long term, we would actually save money.
Yeah, so way cheaper, and this applies to any aspect of life too, way cheaper to invest long-term proactively than it is to just be in a strictly reactive position.
Yeah. And people are experiencing the stress of this not only in their tax dollars, but also in overcrowded emergency rooms,
Yeah.
police services overwhelmed trying to respond to crisis calls, downtown businesses complaining that their customers have barriers to entering their businesses because of the number of unhoused people on our streets. The costs, it's not only a financial cost, it's a cost to our quality of life. And so we all benefit, like each and every one of us benefit when we make the investments to ensure that people are housed and that they're not living in poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess on that note, I mean, ODSP recipients and especially BIPOC folk are at the highest risk of food insecurity, mental health issues, homelessness, like you said, and much, much more. And we've already touched on the role that needs to be played by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs to address this intersecting issue. But is there also a role for the federal government as well?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the federal government absolutely has a role to play, and I think it's a two-part role. So one is the federal government has more fiscal capacity than the provinces. So I'm a strong advocate in the federal government increasing healthcare transfers, for example. I've been a big supporter of the federal government bringing in the Canadian disability benefit, ensuring that when I say governments need to invest in housing, that's the provincial government and the federal government. Both governments got out of investing in affordable housing in the 1990s, and the crisis has only been getting worse. So there's a huge role for the federal government to play. But I will have to say, in the case of Ontario, we then needed a provincial government who is going to match those funds, flow those funds to the people and communities that need them. Because one of the challenges we're facing in Ontario is even when the federal government, makes funding available, the province is not always, under the Ford government, a partner in delivering those funds and in matching those funds. So if the federal government's going to step up, and I believe the federal government does need to step up and do more, we need the province to be working with them, not against them, in delivering those funds and those supports for people in our communities. And then I would say that, while I know you want to talk a bit about medical assistance in dying, I have serious concerns that the federal government has expanded, the definition of who's eligible, or the criteria for who's eligible for MAiD. And I think that I understand that was driven by court decisions. And I say this as somebody who, was a supporter of MAiD. But when we start expanding the definition to include people with disabilities or mental health issues, and then we don't provide the services and supports for those folks to lead a high quality of life, then I think we're moving into uncharted territory that's deeply concerning to me, and I know to a number of advocates for people with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember even back when the first wave of eligibility expansion happened, I think that was 2021. That the UN had actually expressed their concern over this expanded eligibility as well. And on top of that, the federal government is set to expand it to include people with mental illness as their sole medical condition as well, which, yes, I'm sure is racking up quite the controversy as well. What role is there for the public in this issue?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things people can do is to work with organizations like ODSP Action Coalition and other anti-poverty organizations who are strongly advocating for doubling of social assistance rates, and the anti-poverty and housing organizations that are really advocating for the kinds of solutions the Ontario Greens have been putting forward to address the housing affordability crisis. And I think it's so important for allies, particularly of people with disabilities, who are advocating, not only for, ODSP rates to go up, but also just for accessible design standards. So housing's accessible to people of all abilities, to ensure that our public infrastructure is accessible for everyone, to ensure that the province meets its AODA standards, to ensure that our, infrastructure, our communities, spaces, and, are accessible to everyone. We can't allow the burden of all that advocacy to fall on people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And people with disabilities, especially those on ODSP, need allies because, if you're already living a life of incredible stress because you're being forced to live in legislated poverty, oftentimes you don't have as much energy left to do the kinds of advocacy work that needs to be done. And so I think that's a really important role that allies can play. And, I would just invite all your listeners, put pressure on this government, put pressure on Conservative MPPs, help people with disabilities, organize protests and rallies to ramp up the pressure on this government, because the budget's coming out soon.
Mm-hmm.
The spring budget will likely come out in March. And I think we need to put a full court press on pushing the government to double social assistance rates, because the 5% increase that they brought in is wholly insufficient. And then they said, we're going to bring in 5% and then connect it to the rate of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that's the case, then people with disabilities will always live in legislated poverty. And that costs the province, as I've mentioned, far too much money, just in terms of our finances. But more importantly, it costs the province, I think, morally and ethically, that we would force people to live in such just difficult and challenging circumstances, because we want everyone in our province to have a decent quality of life and opportunities to thrive.
Mm-hmm. I have one more question for you. How does social assistance in Ontario differ from the other provinces? And is there somewhere that we can look to for a successful model to be implemented here in Ontario?
Yeah, well, I would say if you look at social assistance rates across the country, they're far too low.
Mm-hmm.
And so this isn't just an Ontario problem. This is a Canadian problem.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the cost of living is much higher in Ontario compared to other provinces, primarily because housing costs are so much higher here. And so, this is an issue that I think Ontarians, but all Canadians need to really think about what kind of society we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to build a caring Canada? And that's what I believe in. Are we going to care for our neighbors and the people who we share community and citizenship with? And there are other countries. I mean, I look to a lot of the European countries, especially the Scandinavian countries,
Mm-hmm.
that do invest more in eliminating poverty and addressing housing affordability. And those societies tend to have less crime, less
Mm-hmm.
pressure on their healthcare systems, lower levels of inequality. And so I think they're, a higher quality of life in community. And so I think those kinds of public investments, clearly improve the quality of life for people living in poverty. And, and today we're focused on people with disabilities, living on ODSP. But it improves the quality of life for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we have thriving communities with high levels of quality of life, we all benefit from that. And so, that's the kind of Ontario, Canada, I want to live in, is a community that cares for each other and takes care of our neighbors. And so, yes, we can look to other countries to provide some better models.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes those better models may cost a little bit more for government, but actually cost society less.
That concludes all my questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for being such a passionate advocate for these issues. Beyond the Headlines listeners, you heard from Mike. There's a lot of ways that you can help and become involved in this issue. And
thank you for the
yeah,
time, and thank you for shining a spotlight on such an important public policy issue.
absolutely. Once again, that was MPP Mike Schreiner, who joined us for a discussion on the issue of ODSP poverty, or perhaps I should say legislated poverty, and how too many ODSP recipients are seeking out medical assistance and dying as a result. Just a quick reminder that Beyond the Headlines airs on CIUT 89.5 FM, which is a nonprofit community radio station. Your contribution is needed to enable Beyond the Headlines and all the other programs at CIUT to continue delivering these high-quality programs. Visit www.beyondtheheadlines.net/donate and please give generously. This week, we have brought MPP Mike Schreiner and Secretary Co-Chair of ODSP Action Coalition, Trevor Manon, who are discussing the issue of ODSP and MAiD. And now, back to the conversation. So, Beyond the Headlines listeners, Trevor Manon is our second guest on the show today, and he is the Secretary Co-Chair of ODSP Action Coalition, which is a province-wide volunteer grassroots advocacy group led by people with lived experiences of ODSP, with a network of valued allies, including legal workers, disability and poverty-related NGOs, policy experts, healthcare professionals, and others who advocate for improvements to the income and other supports available to people with disabilities. The coalition was formed in 2002 following province-wide community consultations that found serious problems with the Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP, on which many people with disabilities depend on for their survival. People on ODSP often face unfair stereotyping and discrimination as they struggle to deal with physical and mental disabilities. Each person's situation is unique, but what is shared is a life of poverty. Trevor started the ODSP application process in 2015 while an inpatient at Lyndhurst Rehabilitation Center, and was approved 9 months later in 2016. Around the same time, he came across and joined the ODSP Action Coalition. Prior to his disability, he spent over 20 years in market research and was a semi-professional musician, drummer, for much of his life. Thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us on the show once again.
Thanks, Maria. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So, Trevor, as the Secretary Co-Chair and someone on ODSP yourself, could you tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do at the ODSP Coalition? So, for example, what kinds of people or organizations do you work with? How do you guys lobby for change? And anything else that comes to mind?
How do we lobby for change? We write, we submit pre-budget submissions every time that a budget cycle comes up. We have a list of our asks, our recommendations or demands, however you want to call them. And, we try to educate the public on what's going on. And we're also part of a larger collective, I guess you could call it. It's called Defend Disability, that the members of Defend Disability, we work very closely with ISAC, the Income Security Advocacy Center, who has been a very close partner of ODSP Action Coalition from, way before my time. And, there's people in Defend Disability, there's legal workers, there's other anti-poverty NGOs, I guess you could say, like MAiD, Merchandise United Way, the Daily Food Bank, So ODSP Action Coalition kind of brings the lived experience voice to the table of Defend Disability. And, we come up with strategies and whatnot, advocacy pieces. We submit, like I said, we submit pre-budget submissions. We write letters to the government. We organize workshops and so forth that we help people to know their benefits and know their rights and so forth. We also, we hold rallies in front of Queen's Park. We had in 2022, we had one in April, and we had another one in November, and we had one in September of 2021. The one that we did in 2021 we presented a report card. ODSP Action Coalition put together a non-scientific survey that people could opt into online, and we were able to collect over 700 respondents on that survey. And the survey was set up so it was kind of like we were grading the province like a teacher grading students, giving letter grades on specific aspects of ODSP, and then we presented this big report card at the end of it when we did the rally in September of 2021. And of course, the majority of the items on that list were an F. The highest grade that was given was a C, and that was for people rating their ODSP caseworkers, which was to see that, like anything, there's good caseworkers and there's bad, there's good ones and there's bad ones. We presented that report card, and we just tried to, everybody shares information in our network. We exchange ideas. We participate in, media outreach like we're doing now. Just anything we can think of, to kind of get it out there that people on ODSP, people with disabilities, especially people that are unable to work, are living in legislated poverty.
Yeah.
And it's not right. It's even with the 5% increase that the Conservative government gave in September, that was granted. It was very, it was remarkable. It was out of character for a Conservative government to increase a social program. The last time that ODSP was increased by a Conservative government, you'd have to go back to 1985 under Bill Davis. That was the last time that, the 1.5% increase that the province gave to the benefit rates when they came into power in 2018, they were patting themselves on the back for giving a 1.5% increase that worked out to like 20-something bucks a month for the average client. And the 1.5, it was actually supposed to be a 3% increase that was on the books from the previous Liberal government. They put through legislation that was going to have 3 annual 3% rate increases. So when the Conservative government came in, they cut the first one in half. So we got a 1.5% increase, and then they got rid of the other 2 increases. So that 1.5% increase, even though they were saying it was an increase, it was really a cut from the proposed 2% increase. Increased rates in September of 2022 by 5%. Obviously, 5% isn't enough.
Yeah, especially there's such a clear link between poverty and health, and right now with our public healthcare system under collapse, if not already collapsing, and food banks stretched thin, and the lack of affordable or permanent housing. Could you share with us what that experience has been like?
Yeah, well, it's according to the Bank of Canada, their inflation calculator, if you look at that, according to the Bank of Canada, a basket of goods and services that cost $100 in 2018 now costs $114. So that's over a 14% increase. The 5% increase that was given in September it didn't even replace half of what's been eroded by inflation since 2018. With the stuff going on with healthcare right now and privatization and so forth, it does have a direct and indirect impact on people with disabilities. if the province starts introducing service fees, which they've already done, for instance, if your ear was clogged, for instance, and you had to get your ear irrigated or whatever they do to clear the blockage, OHIP used to cover it. Now OHIP doesn't cover that anymore. I think you have to pay like $35 or something if you go to get that done. So introducing these little user fees here and there, it may sound insignificant to like maybe the mainstream majority, but for somebody on ODSP, that $35 could mean the difference, between visiting a food bank that week or not visiting the food bank that week. It's not a good situation, that's for sure.
Yeah, and honestly, this two-tiered healthcare system that we're seeing unfold is truly heartbreaking, in my opinion. I mean, I came across a tweet from, I think it was Jagmeet Singh actually, who said that the federal government gave the province about $775 million for surgical backlog, and about 24 million of that went to the CEOs of the for-profit clinics and hospitals here in Ontario. And it's quite disappointing to see that we're well on our way to an American-style healthcare system where the private system will be out of reach for the majority of people, especially those on poverty, of course, and they'll be left with the kind of the rut of the system, which would be the public healthcare system. Do you see this, I guess, affecting the work of the coalition at all, or I guess just the community in general?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's really going to change a lot of what we're seeking. It's kind of another drop in the bucket of the extra costs that come with living with a disability.
Yeah.
Sometimes people don't often realize that having a disability can be expensive. Not the medication that you're prescribed is covered under the Ontario drug benefit.
Yeah.
And it's I wasn't aware of those CEOs being gifted all that money from the federal government through the federal government.
Sorry, I should probably clarify. The federal government gave the province, like the Ontario government, the transfers, and a lot of that money did not go to where it was supposed to go, which is, I guess, just another, like you said, drop in the bucket. Yes, yeah, exactly.
It's not really surprising, and they say that there's no money to increase ODSP rates.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, if you own 5 cars, guess you got like a $500 check from the government last year. The license plate stickers that were rebated to people, and then the government giving back billions of dollars from WSIB, the workplace insurance.
Yeah.
The government is starving social programs of resources, and it's leading to, starting with the privatization of healthcare. There's also privatization of employment services that has been ongoing since 2019. That's kind of started when the province decided to revamp, the employment services transformation, that's called. And they're putting out tenders for for entities to bid on. It started with 3 pilot areas with Hamilton, Peel region, and the Muskoka-Kawarthas region. They put out the city of Hamilton bid on that to become their own, they call it service system managers. The city of Hamilton bid to become their own service system manager they didn't win it. It went to a company called FedCap, which I believe is an Australian company, or it might be American. Peel Region went to a group called WCG, which is another, not-for-profit entity, so to speak. So it's like municipalities are being outbid by private enterprise to run their own employment services for people on social assistance. And, they collapsed everything together under one Employment Ontario. There used to be a separate system for ODSP employment programs, for instance. Now it's all under one umbrella. So it's just, the privatization of healthcare is just another conservative move that, that is taking money out of public systems and putting it into quote unquote not-for-profit hands at times. They say not-for-profit, but when CEOs are getting paid millions of dollars, how not-for-profit can it be? Right?
This, like, what we're seeing is the results of when you're putting profits over people, point blank. And to your point, when you said that the government does have money to spend on social services, it's just a matter of political will and like Mike Schreiner said earlier, priorities, misaligned priorities. And it's quite defeating, I'd say, for I obviously can't speak for you, but I'd say for students like myself who are trying to make a difference and do the opposite, put people before profits. It seems really defeating at times to do just that, because it's like the weight of the world's against you almost. And so I applaud you and your organization for trekking through that and for not giving up hope. And by the way, Beyond the Headlines listeners, there are plenty of ways to get involved and to take action on this issue. There's a lot of protests being organized, like Trevor alluded to. Of
course, we have a lot of very valuable allies and people that we consult with, that we hash things out. And so it's not like just us flying on the seat of our pants. There's a lot more to the ODSP Action Coalition than just a Twitter page or a Twitter profile. There's a lot of, we're plugged into quite a vast network of people that, are sort of all looking for the same things to alleviate poverty and social justice issues. Well, going back, they changed the asset limit to $40,000. It was after I already qualified for ODSP, so it missed me. But, that was one of the things that we pushed for and we actually wound up getting, so there are, people might say, well, what's the good of you? But we do track incremental successes, and we have to celebrate those, however small they may seem. We have to celebrate those successes. Among our asks, we're still asking for, to replace the myriad of rate structures that are available to people on ODSP, because depending on your living situation, you might get a different amount. For instance, you're homeless. Well, ODSP is divided into two pieces, right? You get basic needs, basic necessities amount, and shelter amount. If you're homeless, you do not get the shelter amount. You only get the basic necessities amount.
Wow.
You're trying not to be homeless, but they're saying, well, you can't have money. You can't pay for shelter until you have it.
Wow.
It's like I say, who comes up with this shit, right? It blows my mind.
Seriously, who does come up with this?
And people that, for instance, are in a room and board situation, like they call it a lodge, the lodge rate. So they would get less money because their meals are paid for. So we're asking that, we want a flat rate structure, it's called, so that everybody gets the same amount.
Yeah.
Combine the shelter allowance and the basic necessity allowance into one amount and just give them that amount. It's worth mentioning that the 5% increase that happened in September, if you are in rent geared to income housing or subsidized housing, you did not get the shelter amount increase because your shelter's covered under rent geared to income. So a lot of those people didn't get the full 5% increase. They only got an increase to their basic necessities, which worked out to about, $34.
Yeah, penny change.
Yeah. So, we want to get rid of that, and it will also get rid of very intrusive questions about your living arrangement, who you live with, how much do they make, because when you're in a household with other people, you tend to get scrutinized very hard about who's paying the rent and how much are they paying. We get rid of that. And we'd also like a major expansion of the Canada-Ontario housing benefit. We were talking about social housing earlier, and eviction applications have accelerated. You see it in the news every day, people getting evicted, and 10 cities popping up in every municipality all across the province.
Yeah.
Well, all across the country, really. The privatization of housing is just fueling this, the homelessness crisis.
Yeah.
And it's like we keep doing the same thing. Oh, Doug Ford wants to take a bunch of the Greenbelt and build up 1.5 million houses.
Yeah.
Who's going to afford these houses? One of the questions I mentioned, the survey we did earlier, one of the questions in that was, what is the proportion of your income that you spend on rent every month? And out of those 700 respondents, the average was 66% of your monthly income went towards rent. But that included people that were in rent geared to income and subsidized housing, right down to people who paid 100% of their income on rent. And there were also people that responded that they were not currently housed, that they were coaching or whatever.
Yeah.
So we would like to see a major expansion of the Canada-Ontario housing benefit. It's a portable benefit which allows people to stay in the communities in which they have a support network built up around them over years. For somebody to pluck somebody out of their community and put them way on the other side of town in a building surrounded by an industrial area, and you're next to some subway tracks, and the closest grocery store is a half a mile away, and you don't know anybody. It's cruel and unusual punishment. It strips people of their dignity and their autonomy, their right to self-determination. I can go on about the Social Benefits Tribunal and the backlog there now. The recent report that Tribunals Watch Ontario, who is an ally of the coalitions, the recent report that they put out indicated there was over 9,700 backlog cases at the Social Benefits Tribunal. So these are people that are waiting for months, 9 months, up to a year for a hearing, and they're, because they were cut off. So these are people, this is how people become homeless.
Yeah.
Waiting for a hearing that never happened. And the hearings are all digital first now. So they're all done over Zoom. So you don't have access to the skills required to, interface with somebody on Zoom. If you can't afford internet, which many people on ODSP can't. You can't even go to your own hearing, and it's just a mess what's happening at Tribunals Ontario.
It's almost as if they're putting these barriers in place deliberately, because some of these just kind of go against basic logic too, in my opinion. Like, for example, not allowing someone experiencing homelessness to obtain the living allowance on ODSP is just backwards logic to me, because for the reasons that I don't need to even go into. But I have a few more questions, and I did want to get into the topic of MAiD, medical assistance in dying. I just have two questions on it. So in 2021, the federal government expanded the eligibility to MAiD to include those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. And already that raised some controversy, rightfully so, I think. How do you, or I guess you could speak for the coalition as a whole, but how do you or the coalition feel about this expanded eligibility to MAiD?
The coalition, we didn't really wade into the debate about MAiD initially. There was a lot of advocates warning that this was going to happen. And by this, I mean people living in poverty, applying for MAiD as an escape. And as the issue became bigger and bigger, and more stories were coming out about it, and about, you know, it comes down to, for ODSP Action Coalition, it you know, moral sort of implications aside, for us, it really boils down to adequacy and being provided adequate resources in order to live a life with dignity. You know, and it's, but the government would rather allow you to kill yourself with dignity, you know, to end your life with dignity, than provide you with the resources to live with dignity. Expanding it to mental health, I think the government needs to take a serious pause and look at this. You know, I'm not a psychiatrist, obviously. I'm not a doctor. But from things that I read and so forth, that, you know, mental illness can be very sporadic, and it can be very episodic. Is in a severe state of depression right now. It doesn't mean that they're going to be in a severe state of depression 1 year from now. I know people, you know, personally, that, you know, were not even able to get out of bed for months at a time, and now they're thriving and they're flourishing. Advocates warned that this was going to happen. The government said, no, there's going to be safeguards in place. And now we're hearing stories about, you know, medical professionals sort of pushing the idea of MAiD on people. You know,
really?
There was a story not too long ago about a nurse or a doctor that was, you know, pushing MAiD on war veterans. Some stories that came up with that, and there was some, you know, that person that was doing that apparently is no longer employed as a healthcare worker. And I've seen videos, you know, we receive a lot of emails at the coalition, as you can very well imagine, people in various states of distress and despair. And we do our best recommendations. You know, we tell them that we're not qualified to offer legal advice, but we can point them to resources that, you know, that they may be able to help them and advocate for themselves. But yeah, with MAiD, it is very disturbing, and I'm not sure what the solution is. You know, what sort of things can be put in place so that people are not wishing to end their lives because they cannot be afforded a life to live with some sort of dignity. You know, Canada now has the most liberal laws in the world when it comes to medical assistance in dying. You know, and there's stories running in papers all over the globe about Canada. Look what Canada's doing. You know,
very huge issue here in Canada, and I'm glad that you're here talking to us about this, because it really is important for our listeners as well. The most important thing that they can do, honestly, is put pressure on our current administration. Reach out to your MPPs, your MPs. I'm still holding out hope, and I hope you guys are too. especially being ODSP recipients yourselves, doing all this advocacy work on the side it must be exhausting. Hats off to all of you. I just have no words to describe, the strength and resiliency you all hold.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's when people say, why bother? We got a conservative government with a huge majority. They're going to do whatever they want. I was involved in a meeting, or the coalition was involved in a meeting with other members of Defend Disability last year when we met, or in 2021 when we met with Minister Fullerton.
Yeah.
And it was pretty clear that, she really had no interest in anything we had to say. She has her talking points. She has her her marching orders, and she's not going to veer from that, right? But then when you look at it, it's like, well, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Just shut up and do nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
I come from the corporate world and worked in global companies, interacting with country managers all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of used to a very fast-paced sort of environment. So it almost came like second nature. How can I use the skills that I've acquired to some good? I can, it's not like I have to clock in and clock out. I do it on my own time, as does every member of the coalition. We all have our own personal situations that we have to deal with, and everybody's situation is unique to them. But we all, we all do what we can, right? Like I said, what's the alternative? But I really appreciate your time, Maria.
Yes.
Thanks for allowing us the opportunity.
Absolutely. And yes, once again, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience and your story and telling us what we need to do to get on this issue. Once again, that was Trevor Manon, who joined us for a discussion on ODSP and MAiD. Thanks for tuning in. You've been listening to Beyond the Headlines on CIUT 89.5 FM. That wraps up our show for this week. We were joined by MPP Mike Schreiner and Trevor Manon, Secretary Co-Chair of ODSP Action Coalition. Many thanks to them for coming onto the show to discuss the issue of ODSP and medical assistance in dying. Today's show was produced by myself, Maria Svetkova, alongside with my co-producers, Antoine Fougere-Ramsamouge and Jordan Agan. If you liked today's episode, please like and review us whenever you are listening. The views expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect the views of the producers, CIUT, or the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. If you missed any part of the show, be sure to check out podcasts of all our episodes on our website at www.beyondtheheadlines.net, as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you're a fan of our show or want to stay up to date with policy issues in Canada, follow us on Twitter at beyond_headlines. You can also check us out on Facebook or Instagram. Be sure to tune in next week as we continue to take public policy discussions out of the hallways and onto the airwaves.